Not the one with the fists, not the one with the speed, not the one where he defeats someone in 3 seconds while the camera tries to keep up. This one has no fight, no punch is thrown, no voice is raised, and yet by the end of it, a man who walked into a room with total authority walked out of it with almost none. And Bruce Lee never touched him. He never said a word to him. He never even looked at him directly. This is the story of what happened in that room. And more than that, this is the story of what it means for you. Because what Bruce Lee understood, what he had refined into something almost invisible, was not a fighting technique. It was not a philosophy you read in a book. It was something older than both of those things. Something that most people spend their entire lives inside of, without ever once seeing it for what it is. It was the understanding of how authority actually works, not how it looks, not how it sounds, not the titles or the posture or the tone of voice, but how it lives and breathes and depends on something most people never think to question. Let me take you into that room. The year is 1967. It is a Tuesday afternoon in Los Angeles, and the light coming through the windows of the training hall is the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more serious than it is. Dust moves slowly through it. The floor is wooden and worn smooth in certain places where feet have moved the same way for years. The walls hold nothing decorative. This is a working space. It has the feel of a place where something real happens. There are 11 men in the room. 10 of them are students. One of them is the instructor. His name is not important for this story. What is important is what he carries when he walks. There is a particular way that authority announces itself in a person before they have said a single word, and this man had it. You would have noticed it immediately. The straightness of the spine, the measured quality of the breath, the way his eyes moved around the room, not searching, not anxious, but confirming, taking inventory, everything in its place. He had been teaching for 9 years. 9 years is long enough for authority to stop being a performance and become a habit. Long enough that you stop thinking about how you are being perceived and simply exist inside the assumption that you are being received in the way you intend. He had earned that assumption. His students respected him, not the kind of respect that is simply obedience, but the kind that comes from genuine recognition. They had watched him do things they could not yet do. They had felt the quality of his corrections. They had stood close enough to him to understand that what he possessed was real. So when he began speaking that afternoon, the room received him the way it always did, with attention, with readiness, with the quiet, collective leaning in that a good instructor produces without effort. He was teaching footwork, not the dramatic footwork of combat, the invisible kind, the kind that most students spend years ignoring because it lacks the satisfying clarity of a strike or a block. He was talking about weight distribution, about the subtle difference between a stance that responds and a stance that braces. He moved as he spoke, not to demonstrate, but because for him, movement and language had become the same thing. One informed the other. The students watched. They moved slightly when he moved. The room had a rhythm, and then, at 2:07 in the afternoon, the door opened. Bruce Lee stepped inside. He was 26 years old. He was wearing a plain jacket and dark trousers. He had a cup of tea in his left hand, and he was not in a hurry. He looked around the room once, briefly, the way a person does when they are orienting themselves to a new space, and then he found a spot along the back wall, and he stood there. He did not bow to the instructor. He did not introduce himself. He did not signal in any way that he was a guest, or a student, or a visitor deserving of acknowledgement. He simply arrived, and stood, and watched. The instructor noticed him. Of course he did. You do not ignore Bruce Lee when he walks into your room, even if you do not yet know exactly who he is. There was something about his presence that registered before analysis could catch up with it. The instructor gave him one quick glance, the kind that says, "I see you, you may stay," and then returned to his students. This was the right thing to do, the professional thing, the thing a man of authority does when someone enters his space. He does not defer, he does not pause for the arrival. He continues, because the class does not stop for a visitor. The room does not reorganize itself around a new presence. The instructor continued speaking. His tone was steady. His movement was clean. The students were still watching him. Everything was as it had been. And yet, something had changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, not in any way that any of the 11 people in that room could have pointed to and named in that moment. But it was there, the way a change in air pressure is there before anyone looks up at the sky. It was there. Here is something that takes most people a long time to understand. Authority is not a thing that lives inside a person. It is a thing that lives between people. It is not generated solely by the one who holds it. It is generated by a relationship. It is produced by an environment. It depends in ways that are almost never examined on the agreement of everyone present. Think about the last time you were in a room where someone clearly had authority. A teacher, a senior colleague, a leader of some kind. Think about what made their authority feel real. You might say it was their experience, their knowledge, their tone of voice, and those things contributed, yes. But here is the question that cuts deeper. Would that authority have felt the same if the room had been different? If the people in it had been different? If someone had walked in who did not share the same frame of reference, the same set of unspoken agreements, the same context that makes the authority legible? The honest answer is no, and that is not an indictment of the person with authority. It is simply an accurate description of what authority actually is. It is contextual. It is relational. It is, in a very real sense, a group agreement that most groups never consciously make, because they never have reason to question it. Bruce Lee understood this, not as a tactic, not as a manipulation, not as something he had read in a book on influence or power. He understood it the way a person understands gravity, not as a concept, but as a lived physical truth that had been confirmed for him so many times, through so many situations, in so many rooms, that it had become simply the way things were. He understood that authority is borrowed from its environment, and that the moment a new element enters that environment, one that does not share the same agreements, does not operate within the same frame, does not perform the same deferences, the environment shifts, not because the new element attacks anything, not because it challenges, not because it does anything at all, but because its mere presence introduces a second frequency and two frequencies in the same space, even when they do not interact directly, produce something different from what either one produces alone. This is physics, and it is also psychology. And on that Tuesday afternoon in 1967, Bruce Lee was the second frequency, standing quietly along the back wall, cup of tea in hand, watching. The instructor was now 15 minutes into the class. He had moved from footwork into something more nuanced, a discussion of intention, of how the body telegraphs its plans before the mind has finished making them. It was good material, the kind that requires a certain level of trust between teacher and student to land properly, the kind that can sound abstract if the room is not with you. The room was still with him, mostly, but here is what had begun to shift. And I want you to pay close attention to this because it is the center of everything. 3 of the 10 students had glanced at the back wall, not dramatically, not for long. A second, 2 seconds. The way you glance at something at the edge of your peripheral vision that you are not sure is moving or still. A glance that says, I am aware of something I have not yet categorized. They returned their attention to the instructor immediately. But they had glanced, and the instructor had noticed, not consciously, not as a named thing, but something in his nervous system, that ancient, wordless system that monitors the attention of a room the way a plant monitors sunlight, had registered the brief, slight redistribution. His voice did not change. His posture did not change. But he added something, a slight increase in the clarity of his next sentence, an almost imperceptible sharpening of articulation, the kind of adjustment a speaker makes when they sense the room drifting and want to pull it back without appearing to try. It was such a small thing. It would have gone unnoticed by everyone in that room except one. Bruce Lee noticed it. He took a slow sip of his tea. His expression did not change. There is something almost painful about watching a person try to reclaim attention they have not yet lost, because the trying is itself the problem. Confidence does not try, it simply is, and the moment confidence starts trying, it has already revealed a crack, not in the knowledge, not in the skill, but in the assumption. The assumption that the room belongs to it. The instructor did not know he was doing this. That is important to understand. He was not panicking, he was not performing, he was making tiny, almost automatic adjustments the way any experienced speaker does when they sense something shifting. These adjustments had worked for 9 years. They had always worked. The room always came back. But the room had never contained Bruce Lee before. And here is the thing about Bruce Lee that the instructor could not have known, could not have been prepared for, could not have defended against, even if he had understood it perfectly. Bruce Lee's presence in a room was not a neutral thing, not because he was loud, not because he was threatening, not because he performed dominance in any visible way, but because the people in that room, even the ones who had only heard his name, carried an impression of him that had weight, that had texture, that introduced into their awareness a comparison, subtle and involuntary and entirely outside their control, between what they were currently receiving and what they believed, rightly or wrongly, this man standing at the back wall was capable of giving. They were not being disloyal. They were not being disrespectful. They were simply human. And humans, when presented with two potential sources of something, do not simply receive one and ignore the other. They compare. They evaluate, they shift, almost like compass needles, toward what registers to them as a stronger signal. They were not shifting away from the instructor yet, but they were aware of the second source. And that awareness, that simple, involuntary awareness, was already changing the quality of their attention. The instructor could feel it, and he could not name it. And because he could not name it, he could not address it directly, so he continued, adding clarity where clarity was not needed, adding emphasis where emphasis had not been required before, working harder, in tiny invisible increments, for the same result he had previously produced without effort. And every increment of extra effort was a message, not one he intended to send, but one the room received nonetheless. I want to speak to you directly for a moment, not as a narrator, as someone who has been in that room, not that specific room, not that specific year, but the situation. You have been in that situation too, even if you have not yet recognized it for what it was. You have been the instructor. You have stood somewhere, speaking, leading, guiding, doing something you knew how to do, something you had done many times, something that had always worked. And then something shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but something in the room changed, something in the quality of the attention changed, and you felt it, in your chest, in the slight tension that arrived in your throat, in the way you caught yourself checking faces for confirmation you had not needed to look for before. You adjusted, you tried a little harder, you added a little more, and the harder you tried, the more you could feel the thing slipping, not because you were not good enough, not because what you had to offer was insufficient, but because the nature of the situation had changed, and the tools you reached for, the tools that had always worked, were tools designed for the original situation, not this one. This is not a failure of skill. This is a failure of understanding. And the understanding that was missing is this: authority borrowed from its environment cannot be reclaimed by increasing the output. It can only be reclaimed by changing the relationship with the environment itself, which is a much harder thing, and a much rarer thing, and almost no one knows how to do it. 32 minutes into the class, the instructor had moved into a demonstration portion. This was usually where he was strongest. He was a physical man, precise and economical in his movement, and watching him demonstrate was genuinely illuminating. It was one of the things his students valued most about training with him. The gap between his words and his body was minimal. When he said a thing, he could also show a thing, and the showing confirmed the saying in a way that built a very particular kind of trust. He chose one of his more advanced students for the demonstration, a young man who had been training with him for 4 years and who moved well. The kind of student who makes a teacher look better, not worse, because his quality reflects the quality of the teaching. The demonstration began. It was good. The mechanics were clear. The principle illustrated itself through the movement, without needing to be explained. Two of the students began taking notes. The instructor felt the room come back to him slightly. He extended the demonstration, added a variation, showed the counter, then the counter to the counter, building a small, elegant chain of cause and response that had a satisfying internal logic. He had done this sequence dozens of times. It was one of his favorites. It always produced a certain quality of attention in the room, a focused, slightly awed silence. It produced that silence now, and in that silence, from the back wall, Bruce Lee made a sound. Not a word, not a correction, not a challenge, just a sound. A small, quiet sound. The kind a person makes when something they are watching connects to something they are internally processing. A sound of recognition, of seeing something that reminds them of something else, of the mind making a quiet note to itself. It lasted perhaps half a second. The instructor heard it. 4 of the students heard it. And in the particular silence that followed, something happened that no one in that room was prepared for. Every one of those 4 students, without thinking, without choosing to, looked at the back wall, not for long, not dramatically, but they looked. They wanted to know what Bruce Lee had recognized. They wanted to know what had produced that sound. They wanted, in that half second of involuntary curiosity, to see the demonstration through his eyes. And in that moment, the authority in the room relocated, not to Bruce Lee, not away from the instructor completely, but it redistributed, it diluted, it became, for the first time in 9 years of that instructor standing in that room, genuinely shared. And the instructor knew it. He felt it the way you feel a step on a staircase that is slightly lower than you expected. That brief, stomach-dropping instant of miscalculation. He had expected the next stair, and his foot had found air. He completed the demonstration. His hands were steady. His voice was level. He was a professional, and professionals finish what they start. But something in the quality of his completion was different from the quality of his beginning. At the beginning, he had inhabited the room. At the end, he was occupying it. These are not the same thing. Let me tell you something about what it feels like to lose authority you did not know you were borrowing. It does not feel like losing, not at first. It feels like working. It feels like a sudden, inexplicable increase in friction, like the thing that used to slide smoothly now requires effort. Like the words that used to land cleanly now need to be placed more carefully. Like you are doing the same thing you have always done, but the results are coming back slightly smaller, slightly softer, slightly less certain than they used to be. And the response, the completely natural, completely human response, is to do more of what worked before. More clarity, more emphasis, more demonstration, more examples, more investment. Because in the past, more of what worked produced more of the result you wanted. But this is not a situation where more of the same will help. This is a situation where the environment itself has shifted, and you cannot out-effort a shifted environment. You can only recognize it. And then, if you are very honest with yourself, ask what was actually holding the authority in place before the environment shifted. Ask what you were actually borrowing. Ask what the real foundation was. Most people never ask these questions, not because they are not intelligent, not because they do not care, but because the questions are painful, because the honest answers require a kind of self-examination that is genuinely uncomfortable, because it means sitting with the possibility that some portion of what felt like earned authority was actually borrowed authority, contextual authority, authority that existed because the environment agreed to support it and would stop existing the moment the environment changed. The instructor was sitting with something close to this, not consciously, not in words, but in the body, in the tightness behind the sternum, in the slightly increased deliberateness of every movement, in the way he now checked the faces of his students more often than he needed to. He was feeling it without yet knowing what it was. 48 minutes. The class was moving toward its end. The instructor had returned to verbal instruction. He was recapping the principles they had covered, synthesizing the session into something the students could carry with them. This was normally a strong portion for him. He had a gift for synthesis, for finding the single sentence that made 3 previous concepts suddenly cohere. His students often said that his summaries were worth the entire class. He found his sentence. He delivered it. It was a good sentence. Clean, precise, true. 2 of the students wrote it down. The instructor watched them write it. And then, without any plan, without any intention, he said, "I hope that was useful." It was a small thing, 5 words, but they were 5 words he had never said before. In 9 years of teaching, in this room, at this time of the afternoon, in this recapping portion of the class, he had never once said those words. He had never needed to. Useful was assumed. His classes were useful. He did not need to hope for it, because the results spoke for themselves, and the students returned, and the room continued, and the thing was simply true without requiring his endorsement. But he said it, and in saying it, he turned a statement into a question, not grammatically, but emotionally. I hope that was useful. Translation: was that useful? Tell me it was useful. Confirm for me that what I have been doing for the last 48 minutes in front of this room that now contains a second frequency has had its intended effect. One of his students said yes, absolutely. The instructor nodded. He looked at the back wall once, just once. Briefly, Bruce Lee was looking at the floor. He had not heard the sentence, or if he had, it had not reached him in the way it reached the room. He was looking at the floor the way a person looks at the floor when they are thinking about something other than the floor. The instructor looked away. He dismissed the class. The students began to move. Bruce Lee finished his tea. This is the part of the story that matters most. Not what happened after, not what Bruce Lee did next, or what the instructor did, or what either of them said to each other, or whether they spoke at all. The part that matters is this moment, this exact moment, after the class, before the conversation. The moment when the instructor, standing in a room he had stood in 1,000 times, in a space that had always confirmed him, felt something he had not felt here before. He felt like a guest, not fully, not completely, not in a way he would have described in those words, but there was a quality to how he occupied the room in that moment that was different from every other time he had stood in it. A slight excess of awareness about his own presence, a mild, unfamiliar self-consciousness, the sense that the room was watching him from the outside, rather than simply containing him. Nothing had changed in the room. The floor was the same floor. The walls were the same walls. The light through the windows was the same light. Bruce Lee had not said a word to him, had not moved toward him, had not interfered with anything, had simply stood at the back wall for 48 minutes, holding a cup of tea, watching, and making one small, quiet, unremarkable sound. And in that time, the room had subtly reorganized itself around a different center of gravity. The instructor had not lost his authority because it had been challenged. He had lost a portion of it because the thing that had been silently holding it in place had quietly shifted its weight. The agreement had wavered just slightly, just enough, and that, more than any challenge, more than any confrontation, more than any defeat, was the thing that left a mark. Because a defeat you can examine, you can trace its logic, you can find the error, correct it, rebuild. A defeat has edges, you can see where it begins and ends. But this did not have edges. This was ambient. This was the quality of the air. And the most disorienting thing about it was that there was nothing to correct, nothing to address, nothing to confront, because nothing visible had happened. Just a man at the back wall, a cup of tea, a sound that lasted half a second, and everything felt different. Now I want to speak to you again, not about the instructor, about you, because here is what I need you to understand, and I need you to hear this in the way it is meant, which is not as criticism and not as challenge, but as the most useful possible gift. You have authority in your life, in some form, in some space, in some relationship, some role, some room, some context, and some of that authority is genuinely yours, earned, tested, real in a way that would survive any environment. But some of it is borrowed. Some of it lives in the agreement of the people around you, in the familiarity of the context, in the fact that no one has yet introduced a second frequency. And here is the question that Bruce Lee, standing at the back wall, silently asking without asking, makes unavoidable. Which part is which? How much of what you carry into a room is yours, and how much of it is the room's? How much of your confidence is built on genuine internal foundation, and how much of it is built on the reflection you receive from environments that have always agreed to give it to you? This is not meant to destabilize you. It is meant to do the opposite, because the person who has asked this question and answered it honestly, even partially, even imperfectly, is the person who can walk into any room, not just the familiar ones, not just the ones that already know them, not just the ones that have agreed in advance to support the authority they bring, any room with any second frequency present, because what they carry is not borrowed from the environment, it is theirs. It travels with them. It does not require agreement to exist. It simply is, and the room adjusts to it, rather than the other way around. Bruce Lee understood this because he had lived through the version of the story where he was the one who lost something in a room, not once, several times, early in his life, before the training had become what it became, before the understanding had crystallized into something he could carry into any space. He knew what it felt like to speak and feel the room not fully receive what you were saying, to demonstrate and watch people watch you with a quality of attention that was polite but not compelled, to walk into a space carrying the assumption of authority and find that the space did not share the assumption. He had felt the grip loosen, he had felt the ground shift, and instead of reaching for more of what was not working, instead of adding emphasis and force and volume and effort, he had done something rarer. He had stopped. He had looked at what was actually happening, not what he wanted to be happening, not what should have been happening, what was. And what was this: he had been building his presence on external confirmation, on the response of the room, on the agreement of the people in it, on the frame that the context provided. And every time the context changed, every time the room changed, every time the agreement was not automatically in place, he had to work for something that should not have required work. Because real presence, he came to understand, does not require agreement. It does not need the room to confirm it. It exists prior to the room's response. It is not a performance that depends on an audience. It is a state of being that the audience responds to. The work then was not to get better at performing. The work was to stop performing altogether, to find somewhere beneath the performance, beneath the technique, beneath the studied and practiced and refined external expression, the thing that was simply true, and to be that, only that, without addition, without reinforcement, without the borrowed weight of context and agreement and environmental support, just the thing itself, standing in the room, holding a cup of tea, saying nothing, doing nothing, and being, simply by existing, more present than the person who was speaking. This is the discipline that almost no one practices, not because it is physically difficult, not because it requires rare talent, but because it requires a kind of honesty that is genuinely painful. It requires you to look at your own authority and ask what would remain if you stripped away every borrowed element, if you removed the title, the seniority, the familiar context, the people who already know you, the environments that have always confirmed you, the relationships that reflect back to you the version of yourself you most want to see. If you removed all of that, what would remain? What is actually yours? What would travel with you into a room that knows nothing about you? What would stand up without the agreement of the environment? This is not a comfortable question, but it is the right one, because the answer to that question is the actual foundation. Everything else is scaffolding, and scaffolding is useful. Scaffolding helps things get built, but scaffolding is not the building. And the person who has confused the scaffolding for the building will, one afternoon, find Bruce Lee standing at the back wall and feel the ground shift and not know why, and reach for more of what used to work and find that it doesn't. Not because they are insufficient, but because they have not yet found the foundation. They have not yet asked the question. They have not yet done the quiet, uncomfortable, necessary work of separating what is theirs from what is borrowed. In the years that followed that Tuesday afternoon, the instructor continued to teach. He got better at certain things, his technique refined further. His understanding of mechanics deepened. He accumulated more years, more students, more confirmed results, and in most rooms on most days his authority functioned exactly as it had always functioned, because most rooms contained the familiar agreement. Most rooms gave him back the confirmation he was used to receiving, and in those rooms the authority felt solid, real, unquestionable. But there were other rooms where the agreement was not automatic, rooms where someone sat at the edge who did not share the same frame, rooms where a second frequency was present. And in those rooms, something always shifted, something tightened. Hassan, something required more effort than it should have. And on those days, on those particular afternoons, he would feel the echo of that Tuesday in 1967, not as a memory exactly, as a sensation, the slight unsteadiness in the room, the grip that did not hold as firmly as it should have, the 5 words at the end. I hope that was useful. He never fully understood what had happened that day. He knew that something had, but the mechanism of it, the actual engine of the shift, remained outside his comprehension. He filed it under the category of Bruce Lee being Bruce Lee, the exceptional quality that defies ordinary analysis, the presence that cannot be explained and therefore does not require explanation. What he did not understand, what he never arrived at, was that there was nothing mystical about it, there was nothing exceptional about it, in the sense of being beyond ordinary human reach. What Bruce Lee had done was simply this: he had refused to borrow, he had refused to perform, he had refused to need the agreement of the room in order to exist fully within it. He had stood at the back wall, holding his tea, watching, and being entirely, completely, uncomplicatedly himself, not a version of himself that was calibrated for the room, not a performance of himself that was designed to produce a particular response, just himself, without the extra weight of trying, without the slight strain of needing, without the imperceptible but real energy cost of monitoring the room for confirmation. And that simplicity, that effortlessness, that complete absence of the need for agreement is what the room felt. It is what the students felt. It is what redistributed the gravity, not Bruce Lee's reputation, not his skill, not his future achievements or his present knowledge or anything that could be named or pointed to, just the quality of being someone who does not need the room to tell him who he is. And that quality, that specific quality, has a weight that no amount of added emphasis can match, because it is not something you can add. It is only something you can stop taking away. Let me tell you where this ends. Not the story from 1967, the story in you, because that is the only ending that matters here. You have been listening to this for a reason, not because you are curious about Bruce Lee, not because you are interested in the dynamics of authority in a room in Los Angeles 58 years ago. You have been listening because somewhere in this story, in the movement of it, in the slow, quiet unraveling of something that seemed solid, you have recognized something. Maybe you recognized the instructor, the person who is good at what they do, who has real knowledge, real skill, real experience, who has earned genuine respect from the people who know them, who functions beautifully in familiar environments, and who feels occasionally, in certain rooms, a quality of effort they cannot explain, a slight excess of friction, a ground that shifts slightly without visible cause. Maybe you recognized Bruce Lee, not the specific version of him from this story, but the principle of him, the person who can enter a room and simply be, without performing, without needing, without borrowing the room's agreement in order to feel certain of their own presence. Maybe you have met someone like this. Maybe you have been this person, briefly, in a particular state, and recognized the effortlessness of it before it slipped away again. Or maybe you recognize the room itself, the environment that holds agreements most people never examine, the context that lends authority to certain people, not because they have built it, but because the context has agreed to give it, the frame that makes certain things visible and certain things invisible, the agreement that exists below the surface of everything, the silent consensus that this person leads and these people follow, and this is how the room works, and this is who we are here, until the second frequency arrives, and the agreement wavers, and the room shows you what it was actually made of. This is the work, not the technical work, not the skill-building work, not the work of becoming more articulate, more precise, more knowledgeable, more refined in your delivery. Those things are valuable. Do not misread what I am saying. The instructor's 9 years of work were real. The knowledge was real. The skill was real. None of that disappeared when the room shifted. But that work alone is not enough, because the thing that shifts when the room shifts is not the knowledge or the skill, it is the foundation beneath them, the thing the authority actually rests on. And if that foundation is borrowed from the environment, then the environment shifting means the foundation shifts, and you feel it as ground that moves beneath you. The work then is to build a foundation that does not move, not an arrogant foundation, not a rigid one, not the false solidity of a person who has stopped questioning themselves and calls it confidence, a real one, built from the honest examination of what is actually yours, built from the uncomfortable but necessary work of separating the earned from the borrowed, built from the practice, quiet and daily and unglamorous, of existing without needing the room's agreement in order to feel complete. This is not achieved in a moment. It is not achieved by reading this. It is achieved the way Bruce Lee achieved everything he achieved, through repetition, through examination, through the willingness to feel the ground shift, and instead of reaching for what used to work, to stop and ask what the shifting is actually showing you, through the discipline of looking at your own authority honestly enough to find the parts of it that are not yours, and then, slowly, over time, through the work that no one else can see, building something in its place that is. A few last things. The room does not tell you who you are. The room tells you what you have built. The attention it gives you, or withholds, the quality of its reception, the ease or difficulty of the authority you experience within it, all of this is information, not verdict. Information. The room that shifts when a second frequency arrives is not telling you that you are insufficient. It is telling you that part of your foundation is still borrowed. That is useful information. That is the beginning of something. And the person who receives it as information, rather than as threat or failure or something to be overcome by adding more effort, that person has already begun the work that the instructor never did. The second frequency is not your enemy. It is the most honest mirror you will ever encounter, because it shows you what you are when the room stops agreeing. It shows you what you actually carry, what you have actually built, what is genuinely yours, versus what you have been borrowing from the agreement of familiar environments and expecting not to have to return. Bruce Lee changed nothing in that room. He stood at the back wall. He held his tea. He made one small sound. And in doing nothing, in performing nothing, in needing nothing from the room in order to be fully present within it, he showed everyone in it, including the instructor, including the students, including anyone who has heard this story since, what authority looks like when it is not borrowed. What presence looks like when it is not performed. What confidence looks like when it does not need the room to confirm it. It looks like a man standing quietly, watching, holding a cup of tea, not speaking, not acting, not interfering, simply being so completely and so uncomplicatedly himself that the room felt it and shifted, without understanding why, without being able to name the force that moved it. Moved nonetheless. You already know what to do with this. Not the conceptual version, not the version where you nod and agree and file it away as something true that has not yet changed anything. The actual version, the one where you sit with the question of what is yours, where you feel the slight discomfort of honest examination, where you notice, in your own rooms, the moments when you reach for added emphasis, added clarity, added effort, in response to a room that is giving you slightly less than you expected, where you ask, instead of reaching, what is this showing me? What is the shifting ground trying to tell me? What is still borrowed? What have I not yet built? That is the real discipline. That is the work that Bruce Lee did, not in the flashy, visible way, in the quiet, private, unglamorous way that only you will ever fully know, in the room that exists only inside you, where you are the instructor, and you are also the second frequency, and you are also the students watching both, and you are also the ground, deciding what it will support, and you are also the quality of the air. Just before everything shifts, do the work. Build the foundation, not for the room, for yourself, so that when the room shifts, when the second frequency arrives, when the ground moves under someone who has not built what you have built, you are not the one reaching for more emphasis. You are the one at the back wall, holding your tea, saying nothing, needing nothing, simply there, simply complete, and the room knows it. Without knowing how it knows,